Hi, so we're here with Tammy Beckham, who's just finished a program on the Resilient Supply Chain Program at FDA, and we certainly appreciate you being here for ISC. So say a little bit about that program, sits in CDRH, and share a little bit about how it came to be and what the purpose of the program is.
Sure. Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate that. So as I mentioned earlier today, prior to and even obviously during COVID, we had many supply chain challenges, but the vulnerabilities in our supply chain have existed, again, prior to COVID. And so throughout COVID and before, we've really been working with industry and everyone across the medical device ecosystem to address supply chain challenges that ultimately result in patient impact, and oftentimes to our most vulnerable populations. So we've taken the lessons that we've learned during COVID and prior to COVID, and we have formalized and developed a new program that we are in the process of implementing based on the actions during COVID of all the things that we learned about the supply chain and its vulnerabilities. And we're working to really develop a more proactive approach because, as I mentioned earlier during the talk today, we've been really reactive during COVID. And some of that was obviously for good reason, right? So CDRH often heard about supply chain shortages or disruptions when they were imminent or when they had already occurred. And so being reactive, we were able to reduce and mitigate some of those shortages and reduce the impact to patient health. But the goal for this new program is to be very proactive and work with our industry and our patient care, our patients and our hospital systems and our providers, and like I said, the manufacturers and suppliers to understand what vulnerabilities exist for critical devices, those that are essential to have on hand at all times to treat patients. And in doing so, what we want to do is be very preventative. Look at the vulnerabilities, work with the industry to address them, increase resiliency, and really build resiliency in that supply chain. So FDA has a unique role in supply chains. We have a unique perspective. We're able to see across multiple manufacturers. We understand how the devices are used, obviously. We have that medical expertise at the patient care level as well. So what we are looking to do is prevent issues, and with that unique bird's eye view of the supply chain, we can see across that and help prevent those disruptions before they occur.
So is this, you mentioned working with industry a number of times, so you don't dictate to industry. You're facilitating improvements in the way industry approaches its supply chain practices, right?
Right.
So is that about data, or what are some of the tools at your disposal that you're deploying?
Exactly. So that's a great question. So we work with industry very closely. They during COVID, during the public health emergency, as you're aware of the CARES Act and the 506J reporting, there is a requirement for industry to report discontinuances or disruptions in medical device manufacturing. And again, that's during the public health emergency. Post the public health emergency, those authorities do not exist. However, we will be working with industry as we've done during COVID, because I think most people would say together we're stronger, and we've addressed many of these challenges working together. Understanding the supply chain, so having the data to be able to understand where are there interdependencies in suppliers, where are we facing, a heavy resource from international sources. That type of information to do supply chain elimination really helps us work with our industry to enhance resiliency and build practices, our best practices, our share best practices that can be used across the industry.
So, Joe?
I think it's great. I think everybody understands COVID and how that created supply chain problems. But as you said in your presentation at the conference, there have been other incidences recently where supply chains have been impacted, and we continue to see kind of a lingering supply chain issues from the COVID pandemic. Maybe you could talk about some of those other cases and some of the products that were affected.
Sure. So what I can talk about is, during COVID, increased demand really highlighted all the vulnerabilities that we saw. As I mentioned earlier today, we saw device-specific shortages where you might see a shortage because, again, we had heavy reliance on foreign sources for raw materials and finished devices at that time. And so we saw very device-specific types of challenges for PPE, ventilators, testing and diagnostics, etc. But what we've seen over the last 2.5 years is that where the vulnerabilities exist in our supply chain, whether that's single source or whether that's in labor, a smaller number of manufacturers for a specific product, raw material, again, pressures that could be secondary to geopolitical, secondary to energy sector issues, as I mentioned earlier today. We're starting to see these shortages become much more systemic and cross-cutting. So, again, as I mentioned earlier today, a great example of one of these issues that occurred completely independent of COVID, so was not caused by COVID whatsoever, was when the oil and gas industry shut down in the Winter Storm Uri a couple of years ago. So what happened is medical device manufacturers used resin as a raw material component to their medical devices. And when the oil and gas industry shut down, obviously the resin manufacturing shut down, and it impacted multiple devices across many device families. We are still seeing the impacts of that today. So we are still seeing allocations of resin to our medical device manufacturers today. Another example that we're seeing cross-cutting semiconductors, where the medical device industry is really a small buyer for those particular components, and they have to compete with other industries for allocations of those when they go into shortage. So those are the types of systemic issues we're looking at. But we're also seeing labor, whether it's a labor dispute or whether it's just labor in general, and the availability of labor in the U.S. To manufacture at current demand. That's also an issue, a broad issue. And again, we're starting to see some of the energy crisis abroad as well impact devices that we might, or raw materials that we might import foreign.
So, I mean, there are going to be supply chain issues continuing for the foreseeable future, regardless of any emergencies that might occur that could make them worse.
Absolutely.
So you have to be very proactive. What do you see the FDA doing in the future, and what do you see industry doing in the future to help be proactive themselves against supply chain shortages?
Sure. So our program, like I said, is really meant to be proactive, prevent it, and work with our industry. So the more visibility that we have into, especially, and we're talking about critical devices. Again, I'm going to come back to that. We're not talking about boiling the ocean for all the medical devices that are available. We're talking about critical devices that we know that we need to have on hand at all times to treat patients. And as I mentioned earlier today, we are currently leading an effort within the U.S. government and with our external stakeholders to develop a list for critical devices. Okay. So what we really want to do is be able to monitor those critical device supply chains, and we want to be able to identify those vulnerabilities and then look at our options for increasing resiliency and reducing those risks, whether that's in labor, multiple manufacturers, alternative sourcing, and really work with our industry to do that. So what can industry do? Work with us collaboratively to share best practices, to help us identify some of those vulnerabilities and more proactively identify innovative regulatory mechanisms that we can work with them on that will help them address those particular challenges.
So, for instance, if they have to change suppliers, a quicker way to get that alternative supply approved without having to go through an entire different regulatory approval. Okay.
Absolutely. And so those are the types of things that we are working with industry to advance and to look at. I talked a little bit earlier, too, about ethylene oxide and some of the challenges we're facing with terminal sterilization. And as you know, the innovation challenges were a great opportunity for FDA to work with our industry on that. And so there are a lot of ways that we can be working with our industry and innovation and how we communicate to, understanding how best to communicate some of the things that we're seeing to industry. We want to also be able to talk to them about that.
And the EO sterilized supply chain is really an interesting incident because that was not an emergency. That was a couple of states that decided to regulate out EO sterilization for medical devices in there. And that, I know those are new factories are being built elsewhere, but for a long period of time, there'll be a lack of sterilization capability to produce single single-use sterile devices.
Right, and we are still seeing pressures
Okay.
on that component of the supply chain, terminal sterilization and ethylene oxide.
Okay.
And so our program is actively working across CDRH and working with our industry to help understand what are those devices that could be impacted by that, and are there alternatives to alternative sites, or how we might work with industry to help alleviate some of that constraint
sterilization
capacity.
methods.
Right,
things like that.
right,
Okay.
exactly.
So you've mentioned working across different functions, different parts of the organization with FDA, clearly working across government. It sounds
Right.
like there's an all sort of government approach here,
Right.
industry, but you've touched on a couple of things that make me think of some of our other stakeholders within the AMI universe. So our sterilization community, certainly, but I was also thinking of the end user in the healthcare system,
Right.
especially we, of course, are the home for HTM, health technology management, or clinical engineering professionals. Are folks in these other communities also engaged and part of the solution in the long term?
So we are taking an all-of-ecosystem approach to have everybody at the table up front as we start working, or as we have been working through the supply chain issues. So we welcome all participants to work with us as we move forward. And we had a workshop back in June, actually, where we brought together a diverse group of stakeholders to talk about resiliency and what that looked like and how we might move forward together collectively to build that. And so invite every stakeholder that has a component in the medical device supply chain to join us to more proactively build resiliency in that supply chain.
Yeah, well, a lot of that inventory sitting out there in use already. So it's not just about what's on the shelves or what could be on the shelves tomorrow.
Right.
It's about what's already in the hospital or other clinical settings. So, so what are some of the things coming over the next year that you're working on? Are there areas where people can get involved and help? Just tell us a little bit about what the future looks like.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we've been working shortages even prior to COVID, but as we more formally implement this program and leverage our lessons learned, we want to hear from industry about what are some of the great things that worked during COVID, and what are the things that we do not need to let slip by as we move forward. Really, we're going to be reaching out to ask for input into the program. We're already asking for input into the critical device list from a broad group of stakeholders as well, and that will help scope and formalize that program. But, as we talk about putting more of these processes that we learned and these best practices that we learned during COVID, we want to continue to formalize those over this next year. And continue to formalize methods for which we work with industry, and that the input is received for the program.
Okay. So one last question. I know you may have more as well, Joe, but one last one for me. A lot of this extends beyond U.S. borders, right? So we talk about supply chain, especially we've seen a lot of shift to Latin America in terms of sourcing, et cetera. How does a program like this extend into those other parts of the world? Is there an active outreach that takes place? Is it, certainly we spend a lot of time educating folks around the world on the standards they need to adhere to become part of the supply chain. But say a little bit about that, the sort of extended global community and how this affects others outside the United States.
Sure. So the supply chain is global. And so we at CDRH and within our program work with State Department, we work with Department of Commerce, we work with Trade, we work across the USG. And with our medical device stakeholders as well that are global, to look at, again, areas where we can enhance resiliency. So it is a FDA CDRH effort that is very much impacted by the global nature of the supply chain.
Joe, anything else?
Well, I think that's it's been great. It was a great presentation today and a great interview now, and thank you very much for helping us out.
Thank you. Glad
Thanks
to be
for
here. Thanks
everything
for
you're
having
doing.
me. Thanks
we
for,
really appreciate it.
Thanks for the collaboration.
Absolutely.
Thank you.